About 2 years ago, my son Brennan was the beneficiary of a Make-A-Wish trip to Normandy, France. He didn't choose Disney World, he didn't choose Legoland, he chose Normandy because he wanted to go to a place to which he felt connected. And having spent 4 years in the hospital battling leukemia, he had a lot of time to study a lot of things a lot of kids don't really get to study. And he learned of the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, and he felt a kindred spirit to these men who fought every day not knowing if they're going to live to see another one. So me being the parent, I was a beneficiary of this trip along with my wife and 2 other boys, and me being someone who loves and has a strong interest in traditional places, I felt a really strong connection here too. And walking across this bridge in Carentan, which is the town that was made famous, a lot of you may have seen it in the series The Band of Brothers, where the Easy Company secured a convergence point for the men coming off the beaches. I was walking across this bridge and I saw this just perfect little cafe on this serene little river, and it was just almost a spiritual connection to a place that I'd never seen before in my life. And sometimes I think back to myself, what is it about these places that makes me feel so strongly? This is a town in Austria that I've visited 3 times. I think about it all the time. And it's like, what makes me feel when I'm there? Why do I want to live here? Maybe it's just the preservation of the historic preservation of the streets and buildings that they've been for centuries. The fact that no building on a corner's ever been torn down for a parking lot. The fact that the walkability, the fact that people of different backgrounds and incomes live in pretty much the same area where they can walk, shop, worship, play, and pray together. Maybe you felt this. Maybe you've been to a place where you said, gee, I could live here. You know, what is it that triggered you about? Maybe it was the first time you saw the lights of Paris, or the perfect park on the perfect day. Or maybe it was that time with all your buddies on that riverfront park where you got together for just the best rock and roll show you ever saw in your life, or the first time you saw the awesomeness New York. Or maybe it was that day that you were at a park in a city with your kids and they felt safe, and you felt safe because they felt safe and you felt good. Or maybe it's that riverfront that you see once a week, a year when you're at the beach. And then have you ever thought, what are the components of these places that make me feel this way? Maybe it's the fact that a town, many towns, or a few towns, unfortunately, in this city, in this country, like Charleston, South Carolina, the tallest building is a church. It's not a skyscraper. Or when the first time you went to Savannah and you realized that there's a park designed, by design, within 5-minute walk from any neighborhood in that downtown. Or maybe you've been to a town where you've seen a mix of uses, a mix of housing type uses, rather, that would be unthinkable in your neighborhood or in your town, little houses next to big houses, but somehow it works, and that sticks with you. Maybe it's the interest in civic structures and civic and government buildings, or a farmer's market where locally grown food can be had just by walking up to it every week or by subscription. Or maybe it's a place where you stayed in an apartment up above sidewalk dining where you can walk and have a choice to eat at many places just within a couple of blocks without needing a car. Or maybe it's that little town in France where there's no suburban filter between the edge of town and the edge of the countryside. A lot of people, including myself, like to call the common threads that links all these components, the linking thread is called sacred design. The ancient city planners of Greece and Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome studied the basic principles of nature to try to create a built environment where people felt safe and that triggered an emotional response and sense of nationality within the people that lived there. Pythagoras and great thinkers like him studied certain specific ratios in nature that can be applied to the man-made environment. Just like a root chord has a perfect harmony with a third and a fifth, so does building height, the street width ratios. In ancient Greece, the minimum building height to street width ratios is 1:1. Then it goes 1:3, 1:5, and so on. If you've ever been to the little alleys in Venice, you felt this. If you've been to the narrow street in Rome, you felt this. But people respond to a sense of enclosure, and it's something that is a fundamental part of sacred design, the network of built places that make us respond. It was applied to virtually every town in this country up to the advent of the Second World War, because after the Second World War, the automobile became a major economic engine, and then, of course, the funding of federal highways to the Federal Highway Administration. At that point in time, roads were not built as part of a network. They were built to accommodate maximum traffic flow at the peak hours. It was no longer part of the human environment. At least that particular component of it wasn't. This, of course, the sacred design holds true. It's not necessarily in our built environment. It's always in a rural area. God's scale it's always right. Now here are 3 examples of city plans that are within our area. There's Savannah on my right, your left, Charleston in the middle, and North Augusta, which is a late 19th century town on the left. These town plans were woven from that same interconnected fabric, that time-proven fabric of connectivity that provides all of the basic human services or our needs as citizens within the same place. This is a fabric that we've all walked, and but have we all taken the time to notice it? This is an example, a current contemporary example of one city's effort to try to use these principles, at this particularly one in North Augusta, to connect the existing historic downtown to the riverfront. Here you have the same interconnections of roads and alleys and sidewalks to connect to the most valuable piece of property, which in this case is the riverfront. Rather than making the most profit by turning it into private property and private lots, it's now sacred space. It's part of the public realm. Think of it, the network of roads as the veins in a leaf, all these intricate little veins that come through that support the larger body. So too do the urban principles of old support that in the way we live today. Of course, this can be found throughout the country. I chose these 2 slides because one of them is Santa Fe, New Mexico. The other one is Alexandria, Louisiana. I always use Savannah and Charleston. I don't want to get redundant on those. But we can think of towns like Annapolis, Maryland, throughout this country, which have time-proven examples. And these are the places that are beginning to be reborn and that are beginning to thrive in the 21st century because of the way they were built. This is a great example of scale. The little blue box that you see there is downtown Charleston, South Carolina, south of Broad. A lot of you know how intensely developed that area is, but it's a beautifully developed area with great architecture, of course. But there's government buildings, there's churches, there's schools, there's residences, there's restaurants, there's offices, all within that one little area. Underneath it is the North Augusta riverfront I just referenced. That's 200 acres. That's roughly 1.5 Walmarts or 1 golf course. It shows you that an extreme amount of connectivity and human services can be provided in one small area, provided that the thoughtfulness is applied to that. The map you just saw would not be discernible on this map. This is Metro Atlanta. Atlanta is the fastest growing human settlement in the history of mankind. Atlanta is also the least densely populated city in America at 1,500 people per square mile. The next least densely populated is Los Angeles at 5,000 people per square mile. Atlanta has a great network of interstate highways, but being a 10-county area, it has a very poor network of arterials which connect the different townships and counties. Now, if you were to drive from Beaufort Highway all the way up towards Hall County, the only way you could tell that you've moved from one township to the next would be the repetition of Walmarts and big boxes. From a sustainability perspective, it is something that is puzzling planners to this day, and it will certainly puzzle our elected officials well into the future. Just think about it, it's pretty simple. You take 400 feet of road, which includes water line and sewer line. In Atlanta, it may serve 2 to 4 houses. In a traditional town, it'll serve 15 to 20. That pipe has to be replaced one day. That road has to be replaced one day. School buses have to drive that much farther. From a public safety perspective, it's that much more complex. It's an issue. People live one way and aspire to another. In Atlanta, Celeste, I think, believed, she mentioned that there is an average American commute of 20 minutes. In this town, it's 30, all the way up to 90-minute commute. That's 10, at the average, that's 10 and a half days of your life each year in the car. We're not counting about carpool, going back and forth to the grocery store. It's a disconnected community. The limbs on the tree are broken and they can't grow back. Have we become numb to this? Dr. Khalif mentioned that there were cancer patients who refused to admit that they have a disease. Do we not recognize of what we're being fed? Is it like a fast food junkie who doesn't realize that there is not much scenery on this scenic highway? We can change the way we live. Maybe we can take the sign down. This is just a standard example of a typical suburban environment. You have a segregation of housing types by price point and size, and of course segregation of workplaces and commercial centers. Here you have residents that could effectively that are required to get in a car to go get a piece of pizza or to buy something at that shopping center. You may live 150 feet away, but just to make sure you have to drive the car, we're going to put a big retaining wall up and a retention pond in between, and there's probably a barbed wire fence in there somewhere. If you can't drive or you're disabled, you're effectively a prisoner. Where is the sacred public space? The only sacred space you have is within the private realm of your own home, because there is no public realm. Regulations that promote disconnectivity are actually mandated by law. Zoning standards that were originally created to keep us safe from the hazardous workplaces of industrial work sites now segregate us from wherever we work, unless you work at home. Office space is one area, single family in another, multifamily in another, schools in another, commercial in another. Again, just a few arterial roads that are designed for maximum traffic capacity that connect all of them. There's certain the new urbanist movement has now required certain smart growth legislation so that in order to receive your highway funding, you do have to use sidewalks and bike paths. But on a 6-lane road, does that really make sense? Is that a great place to go for a walk? They build them, though. All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of my history. When I became sort of aware about all this, I originally was a project manager for a luxury golf course community developer. We built the best, we built big stuff, we built private, nice golf course communities. And all of these principles, tenets, basically were true. I worked in Tampa, Chicago, San Diego, New Orleans, and Atlanta, and it was the same everywhere. We would have a very well-done golf course community, and there would be another competing community across the way, another gated community across the way. They were separate by housing type. There were even gated communities within the gated communities, so that the big houses were separate from the condo communities. And then the roads in these communities were standard, county-mandated 31 feet curb to curb. That's the size of a 55-mile-an-hour state highway. The streets were walkable, but they were unsafe. If you were to propose narrower streets, it would be tantamount to anarchy. The only solution that they found were speed humps, was the only, at least in my tenure there. And have you ever been to a homeowners association when there's a fist fight? Every month. I mean, you had the golf course people against the non-golf course people, the condo people against the house people, the big house people against the little house people. Everybody was in their little group. And if there were anyone to work out a problem, forget it. I mean, if the dog barks, call me. If there's somebody who's got a grill that smells too bad, send a certified letter to the homeowners association. There was no connection between the people because there was no public realm. People were disconnected from one another, and they were numb. My solution to this was to think back to my roots, to where I grew up. And I used to visit Covington, Georgia, where my mother grew up, which is a great little town just south of Atlanta. And I would stay at my grandmother's house. I could walk to the town square. I could go to the drugstore. I could go sit at the soda fountain and get an ice cream or a grilled cheese. Sometimes the druggist would give me a little cough syrup bottle full of cherry syrup so I could take back to my grandfather so he could make me a cocktail and at the right time of day. And even here in Augusta, my mom could give me money to take the bus to downtown to my grandfather's store on Broad Street. And he'd give me $1 and I could go get a Coke. It was safe. It was connected. I could ride my bike. It worked. It was functional. But what I was doing was disconnected. We began to see that some of the big McMansion homes were no longer desirable for the younger generations. Malls had been closing in Augusta and everywhere else around the country about the time I started working there, and they still plague us to this day. We don't know what to do about it. And rather than addressing traffic with more connection and more streets, we address them with more lanes. So that if you live in a poorer part of town and you have a big highway like this next to you, you've effectively been amputated from the rest of the city. But in some of the smaller towns, while they may be empty, the fabric still exists. The fabric of connection in these smaller towns, it makes these places ripe for renaissance. The fabric may be worn, but it's still there. It was never there in the suburban environment. We've probably seen attempts to address and mitigate some of these issues through local efforts to promote for less obtrusive signage, maybe a little more landscaping or some fancy light poles and that sort of thing. But does that really address the problem? It's like the filter on a cigarette. The poison's still there. It's just easier to intake. You only need to look to Hollywood and to the U.S. tourism industry to know it sells. All right, New York, which when I was a kid was portrayed as a place of the mafia and cops and robbers and all this stuff, today is a hip place. It's where the kooky people on Seinfeld can get together at the diner and talk about issues and laugh, or where the good-looking people and friends can go to their coffee shop and walk back home or walk to their offices. Remember Back to the Future? The good part of that town was the past part. It wasn't the future. It wasn't the present. And then, of course, children's books. My kids, we have lots of children's books. My children are almost grown, but we still have a lot of books. There's not a suburban place within any of them. There are always little towns where the cute little characters can play, or it's a wooded environment with the sanctity of a place like Pooh Corner. And then there's the Andy Griffith Show, the most popular show on television. My children now prefer the Andy Griffith Show, thank goodness, over the Disney Channel. And speaking of Disney, there's Main Street USA. It's a Hollywood set of a typical Main Street in America. People will fly thousands of miles to experience the nostalgia of small town America when they probably have it right in their backyard. The public realm still exists, and it's in cities just like this that are ripe for renaissance. They want to be emulated, preserved, and reconnected. It's a place where different housing types can coexist on the same block. It's a place where new town centers are being designed so that people can live, shop, and play as a daily ritual and a rite. We're starting to relearn the language. These places are now being redeployed into lots of great historic preservation efforts, but certainly in new urbanist efforts, and the functional ones, which are usually typically done to connect a brownfield site maybe to a town center. It's restoring downtowns across the U.S. that will thrive in the 21st century. There was a recent AP story that summarized two polls. One was from the Rockefeller Foundation, the other one was for Transportation America, which showed that the millennial generation is choosing where they live before they're going to choose where they work. They're fleeing their suburban neighborhoods, and they're going to a big city level, New York, Boston, San Francisco, and they're going back to the college towns that they left. They're going to Athens, Chapel Hill, Austin. They're going to places where there's walkability, where there's good schools, where there's parks, where there's transportation options. Half of these kids indicated that they would eliminate the car from their life if they had the ability to do so. And it's the first generation since the automobile was invented where car ownership is declining as a demographic group. And the baby boomers who have been buying the big mansions, they're not retiring to the golf communities in Florida. They're following the millennials to the college towns. They want to rub elbows with youthfulness. They want to be around the hip people. They want to have access to the arts, to restaurants, and basic consumer services. And the mega schools like Columbine, remember that? They're being rethought as we realize that schools are like churches, and they need to represent the character of a community. They need to be designed in such a way that it instills a sense of pride and belonging to the children and the college and high school kids who go there. They are rethinking that model, and that now that they should not be a place that you have to be bused to. And speaking of rethinking models, a lot of the big major retailers are rethinking theirs. They're realizing that customer loyalty and customer experience are maybe a little bit more important than volume. And with that mindset, we do have the ability to change things. Mayor Joe Riley, I believe, John, you talked to Deke about him. Great man. He tells a story in one of his PowerPoint presentations. I'm going to kind of plagiarize, so please apologize for me. But he talks about a man named Willie. He sits out every day at Battery Park in Charleston. He noticed this guy out there every day for years, gazing across the water, turning around and looking at the beautiful buildings behind him. And one day he decided to go up to this man. He said, "Willie, what is it about this place that makes you come here so often?" He said, "Mr. Mayor, it's just beautiful. I feel at home here." Before the Make-A-Wish trip, we lived in a community where we were able to experience something beautiful. And it was done because we were living together with people from very diverse backgrounds from all over the world, with the one commonality was that we were all in pretty much dire life or death circumstances. But because of good scale, thoughtful design, access to basic services, and a sense of community, all of which can be tracked all the way back through that path of time, we felt a very sacred sense of beauty and connection there. It was one of the most powerful living experiences I've ever had. It's nothing more than a return back to the source from which all design was created to begin with. As Mayor Riley says, Willie deserves something beautiful. We all deserve something beautiful. But first, you must accept it, just like love, and then you must embrace it, and then you've got to give it back. That's the secret of reconnection. Thank you.